A weathered life ring begins the story. Once fixed to the side of a Royal Navy heavy cruiser, it was there for a simple practical purpose: to save a life in an emergency. Painted across its surface are two words: HMS Dorsetshire. It's solid, functional, and unassuming, the kind of object sailors would have passed by every day without so much as a second thought. But it carries with it the legacy of a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser, hundreds of sailors, and a story that stretches from the cold grey seas of the North Atlantic to the heat of the Indian Ocean, through some of the most pivotal moments of the Second World War. This is the brief history of HMS Dorsetshire, the ship that helped sink Bismarck and was herself lost less than a year later. HMS Dorsetshire was a county-class heavy cruiser, launched at Portsmouth in 1929 in a world still trying to convince itself that the First World War had been the war to end all wars. This piece of rope, which we still hold, helped ease her into the water at Portsmouth Dockyard. That rope is now dry and brittle, but it once marked the beginning of what must have felt like a proud and permanent addition to the fleet. HMS Dorsetshire had a complement of 41 officers and 622 ratings. She carried 8 8-inch guns in 4 twin turrets and could steam at 31 knots with the endurance to patrol vast imperial sea lanes. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had imposed strict limits on naval armament. Cruisers could displace no more than 10,000 tons and carry guns no larger than 8 inches. Naval architects thus became masters of compromise. You could have speed, you could have firepower, you could have range, but in order to have all three, armour had to give. Throughout the 1930s, she served around the Empire flying the white ensign, and if you'd seen her crew then, they'd have worn hatbands like this one, with the ship's name proudly displayed in gold. Before 1939, you wore your ship's name openly. It was a mark of identity and pride. You belonged to your ship, and your ship in turn belonged to its country. When war broke out, that stopped, and ships' names were removed from cap tallies for security. In May 1941, HMS Dorsetshire was in the North Atlantic during one of the most famous naval hunts of the war, the pursuit of the German battleship HMS Bismarck. The Royal Navy had already lost HMS Hood, and the pressure was enormous. On the 27th of May 1941, after Bismarck had been battered into a burning wreck by HMS Rodney and HMS King George V, HMS Dorsetshire was ordered to close in and finish the job. She fired torpedoes into the stricken German battleship, the final blows in one of the most dramatic naval engagements of the Second World War. We have in the museum a naval captain's pennant flown from HMS Dorsetshire that day. Its previous owner, CPO Arthur Taylor, was also on Dorsetshires Bridge during the action that ended Bismarck. It measures 80mm by 2,250mm and was originally white ground with a red cross. Though after many years spent on the pub wall before coming to the keep, it is quite badly discoloured. But Dorsetshires' role that day is remembered for something else as well. When Bismarck finally sank, hundreds of German sailors were left in the freezing Atlantic waters, when Dorsetshire began hauling them aboard. Exhausted, hypothermic, clinging to debris, Dorsetshire pulled in as many as she could, some 82 sailors, until a U-boat sighting forced her to leave the scene. But for a brief moment, in grey water under a grey sky, the crew of HMS Dorsetshire saved the lives of men who had only hours before been trying to kill them. War is brutal, but it is not always without humanity. In 1977, the HMS Dorsetshire Association even held a reunion for survivors of Bismarck, Dorsetshire, and HMS Maori, who had also participated in the pursuit and destruction of Bismarck, rescuing some of its men alongside Dorsetshire. The invitation read, "In the end, we were all in ships that were sunk. We must never forget that it took a war to make us friends." Less than a year later, HMS Dorsetshire was far from the Atlantic. In April 1942, she was operating in the Indian Ocean as part of the British Eastern Fleet. Japan had entered the war, and its carrier strike force, 53 Aichi D3A2 or Val dive bombers, were now sweeping into the Indian Ocean. On the 5th of April 1942, HMS Dorsetshire and her sister ship HMS Cornwall were caught by Japanese carrier aircraft southwest of Ceylon on their way to Colombo to replenish their fuel. What happened next was as swift as it was devastating. Dive bombers appeared overhead, high and then screaming down in near vertical dives. Dorsetshire's anti-aircraft guns opened up, but she was designed in the 1920s, and her armour was thin as a result. Her anti-aircraft armament, improved since commissioning, was still insufficient against concentrated carrier air power. Bombs struck with devastating accuracy, one, then another, then more. Within minutes, bombs tore through her deck, fires spread, and power failed. Among those aboard HMS Dorsetshire that day was George Bell, who had joined the ship's company as a 16-year-old in 1940. Years later, he would recall her final moments on Easter Sunday, 1942. At 7 minutes to 2 on Easter Sunday, the first bombs struck home, and then it just became an endless mass of explosions. She was on fire, all her upper deck platforms had gone, the engine and boiler rooms no longer existed, and her crews with them. It was carnage and hell. Only 7 minutes that seemed like 7 years. She should never be dying like this. It was with tears in our eyes and hate in our hearts that the orders came to abandon ship. Magazines had been flooded, and those in them would never be able to ask why. She was a torch inside, and yet throughout this maelstrom of terror, discipline held fast, and those of us that were left entered the sea like those of the Bismarck survivors, to face whatever lay ahead. When we were all off, we looked back to see her going down, stem first with her bows proud in the air. Better Davy Jones's locker than being taken to some breaker's yard for scrap. It was difficult to believe that this proud and beautiful ship had gone forever. R.F. Wilson, who was responsible for the Dorsetshire's high-angle, low-angle anti-aircraft defence, remembered her final moments in similarly haunting detail. "I'll always remember the last sight of the Dorsetshire. She righted herself. She was sinking by the stern, and as her bow rose higher and higher, you could see all kinds of stuff like anchors and other things falling off the decks as she stood right up on her stern, with her nose straight up in the air. Then she went down with a rush. She capsized and sank in around 8 minutes. Over 230 men were killed, and the cruiser that had sailed thousands of miles and served in multiple theatres of war was gone beneath the Indian Ocean. The survivors, hundreds of them, were left in the sea under the April sun in oil-slicked water, clinging to rafts and wreckage and each other. For more than 30 hours, the survivors drifted in the Indian Ocean, exposed to the burning sun, exhaustion, and the ever-present threat of sharks. Rescue finally came in the form of the destroyers HMS Paladin and HMS Panther, along with the light cruiser HMS Enterprise. The weakened men were brought aboard safely and ultimately dispatched among the bigger ships of the Eastern Fleet. Bell later reflected on the aftermath. So it was over. Goodbyes and farewells took place as boats arrived alongside to take us to our new ships. We knew that a chapter in our lives had ended with the sinking of HMS Dorsetshire, and that it would never be the same again, no matter what ship we would be serving in. And it's from survivors like George Bell that come some of the most moving objects relating to HMS Dorsetshire we hold. Mounted on a wooden shield is a pottery plaque, a crowded lion over the word Dorsetshire. Beneath it, a small silver-coloured plate reads, "From the survivors of HMS Dorsetshire, sunk by enemy action, 5th of April 1942. To our associates of the Dorsetshire Regiment, God bless." It's not grand, it's not even especially ornate, but it speaks to something powerful, the bond between county regiment and county ship, between soldiers and sailors who shared a name and an identity tied to Dorset. We also hold a White Order of Service card. It's from a memorial service held at St. Peter's Church in Dorchester on Sunday the 4th of April 1982 at 11 a.m. 40 years after the sinking. 40 years on, they were still gathering and still remembering. Many of the young sailors in 1942 would have been elderly men by 1982. Some would have attended and some would not have lived to see it. The memory, though, persisted. The order of service is modest. Hymns, prayers, readings, nothing out of the ordinary, but it marks the endurance of a community built around a ship that had ceased to exist 4 decades earlier. Steel and rivets can vanish quickly, but memories take far longer. In the aftermath of HMS Dorsetshire's sinking, the people of Dorset raised more than £3 million in war savings within 6 months, surpassing their original target of £2.75 million, in the hope of seeing the heavy cruiser rebuilt. Yet despite this extraordinary effort and repeated appeals from both Dorset residents and the HMS Dorsetshire Survivors Association, the ship was never replaced. A renewed campaign emerged in 2002 when the Royal Navy Association branch in Dorchester pressed for the name to be revived after Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon announced a £6 billion programme for 12 new D-class destroyers. Once again, however, the effort proved unsuccessful, and the name Dorsetshire has yet to return to the Royal Navy's order of battle. The story of HMS Dorsetshire survives today in fragments. A rope from her launch in 1929, a masthead pennant that flew during the destruction of Bismarck, a plaque from survivors who endured the Indian Ocean, a memorial service card printed 4 decades later. Each object alone appears small and contained, but together they trace the arc of a ship's life: optimism, action, loss, and remembrance. HMS Dorsetshire's story sits at a hinge moment in naval history. In May 1941, she helped destroy a battleship, the archetype of naval power in the early 20th century. The next year, she herself was destroyed by aircraft, a weapon that would dominate the rest of it. Within 11 months, she had stood on both sides of a revolution in warfare at sea. The age of the battleship was ending. The age of air power had arrived. And HMS Dorsetshire, designed under the assumptions of the 1920s, had paid the price. For 13 years, the name HMS Dorsetshire travelled the world's oceans. She had hunted German commerce raiders across the South Atlantic and escorted vital convoys. She fired the torpedoes that helped sink Bismarck and suffered dive bombers in the Indian Ocean. But 8 minutes was all it ultimately took for her to vanish from those very same seas. But HMS Dorsetshire didn't disappear. Not really, because history survives in objects. In fabric, in scraps of newspaper, in wood and ceramic, and in the memories of those who refused to let her name fade. HMS Dorsetshire may no longer be afloat, but in many ways, she still lives on. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories from Devon and Dorset's military past. Thank you to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and to National Lottery players who have made this video and videos like this possible.